On a sweltering Jacksonville afternoon, Ella Monroe, a wheelchair-bound veteran, faces mockery and dismissal at a local diner. Unseen by most, her faded khaki jacket hides a military pin, a clue to her heroic past. As she retreats to her park bench, a Chinook helicopter lands, carrying soldiers led by Lieutenant Colonel Mark Dawson, a man she saved in Iraq. They salute her as Captain Monroe, the ghost medic of Desert Storm, unveiling her extraordinary service. Why now after 28 years of silence? What secrets does Ella still hold? Her story leaves the town forever changed. Love Ella's inspiring story? Subscribe to our channel for more tales of unsung heroes. Your support helps us share stories that matter, uncovering hidden truths and celebrating resilience. Hit that subscribe button, join our community, and never miss a story that could change how you see the world. The sun blazed over Jacksonville, Florida, on a sweltering summer afternoon, the kind where heat shimmered off the asphalt in relentless waves. Ella Monroe, a 63-year-old woman with silver hair neatly tucked beneath a faded khaki cap, maneuvered her wheelchair with quiet precision toward the familiar diner she visited every Saturday. Her hands, weathered but steady, gripped the wheels, pushing her forward despite the ache in her shoulders that never quite faded. Clad in a worn khaki jacket, she carried a small paper bag and a threadbare cloth purse, her posture radiating a dignified calm. Her hazel eyes, sharp yet guarded, stayed fixed ahead, as if the world's noise couldn't touch her. But beneath that composure, a flicker of anticipation stirred. She craved the diner's simple turkey sandwich, a ritual that tethered her to a life she'd once known. Inside, the diner hummed with clatter and chatter. The air smelled of grease and coffee, a comforting mix for Ella, though today it felt heavier. A group of young men, their voices loud and careless, sprawled across the narrow aisle between tables, their chairs jutting out like barriers. Ella paused, assessing the space, her lips pressed into a thin line. One of the men, barely out of his teens, glanced at her and smirked. "You're in the way," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Can't you park that thing somewhere else?" Laughter erupted from his friends, sharp and cruel, slicing through the diner's hum. Another mimicked a frail, elderly voice. "Oh, excuse me, I'm just here for my memories." The words stung, though Ella's face remained impassive. Her heart, however, thudded with a quiet ache, not for herself, but for the ignorance that fueled their jeers. She'd seen worse, endured worse, yet the casual dismissal still gnawed at her. No one in the diner intervened. A server, her apron stained with ketchup, flicked her eyes toward Ella before turning away, busying herself with a stack of menus. Ella exhaled softly, a sound so faint it might have been the air itself, and backed her wheelchair up, yielding the space. She didn't argue or plead. She never did. Silence was her armor, honed over decades of being overlooked. When she finally reached the counter, the waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a pinched mouth, sighed dramatically. "We're full, ma'am. You'll have to wait." The words were clipped, as if Ella's presence was an inconvenience. Moments later, a young woman who'd arrived after Ella was waved forward, her order taken with a smile. Ella's fingers tightened briefly on her purse, but she said nothing. She reached into her bag, pulled out a crumpled $10 bill, and placed it on the counter, its edges soft from years of handling. No one took it. No one apologized. The bill sat there, a quiet testament to her existence, ignored. A small boy at a nearby table watched her, his wide eyes curious. He tugged at his mother's sleeve, his voice soft but clear. "Why's no one helping her?" His mother leaned down, her whisper barely audible. "Some people just get used to being invisible." The words, though not meant for Ella, landed like a stone in her chest. Invisible. She'd felt it before. Hospitals, government offices, even among old comrades. But hearing it spoken aloud stirred a deep, weary sadness. Still, she kept her back straight, her wheels rolling smoothly over the linoleum, the soft hum of her chair the only sound she left behind. As she passed the young men, they high-fived, their laughter trailing her like a shadow. To them, she was a fleeting amusement, a story to retell later with exaggerated bravado. To Ella, they were just another moment to endure. Outside, the sun beat down mercilessly, its glare forcing her to pause and adjust her cap. For a fleeting second, her guard slipped. A shadow of pain, of resignation, crossed her face. She pressed her lips together, banishing it, her expression settling back into practiced neutrality. Few noticed the small military pin tucked inside her jacket, glinting briefly when a breeze lifted the fabric. It was a relic of a life most couldn't imagine, a life she carried in silence. Ella didn't linger. She headed toward her usual spot in the park, where an ancient willow tree offered shade and solace. In her paper bag was a modest loaf of bread, bought earlier from the bakery behind the market, a fallback plan when the diner failed her, as it often did. She settled beneath the willow, her hands resting in her lap, and let the world fade for a moment. But her mind wandered, as it always did, to a photograph she kept hidden in her purse, weathered, its corners softened by time. In it, a younger Ella stood in a medical corps uniform, surrounded by soldiers, their faces streaked with mud but lit with relief. Grenada, 1984. That year, Ella had commanded a rapid response medical team during the invasion. When their field hospital was shelled, she didn't hesitate. Amid the chaos, smoke choking the air, screams piercing the night, she organized the evacuation of 37 wounded soldiers. She carried the last one herself, a boy barely 19, his leg mangled, his eyes wide with fear. Shrapnel had torn into her shoulder, but she ignored the pain, her focus unbreakable. Every step felt like fire, yet she moved, driven by a duty deeper than herself. In '91, during Operation Desert Storm, she deployed to Iraq, treating over 200 soldiers in 3 grueling weeks, many under active fire. One night, with supplies nearly gone and casualties piling up, she performed 3 emergency surgeries by flashlight, shells exploding so close the ground trembled. Her hands never shook, though her heart raced with the weight of each life she held. In '96, Bosnia changed everything. Her helicopter, on a medical evacuation mission, crashed in a storm. The impact shattered her spine, leaving permanent nerve damage. After 22 years of service, she was medically discharged. No medals, no fanfare, no military funeral for the career that died that day. The Army tried to honor her with a Bronze Star, but Ella didn't attend the ceremony. "I was just doing my job," she'd said, her voice firm but hollow. She declined speaking engagements, award ceremonies, reunions. The spotlight felt wrong, a betrayal of the soldiers she'd saved, the ones she couldn't. Her husband, a Chinook pilot, had been her anchor, but he was gone too, felled by a heart attack in 2004 while training recruits. Their daughter, now a doctor with Doctors Without Borders in Europe, called occasionally, her voice warm but distant. Visits were rare, and Ella didn't ask for them. She understood duty even when it left her alone. As Ella sat beneath the willow, the ground began to tremble. A low, thunderous roar filled the air, and heads turned toward the street. A Chinook helicopter descended, its blades slicing the sky, landing with precision in front of the diner. Dust swirled, paper scattered, and the young men inside froze, their laughter dying in their throats. Ella's eyes lifted, a spark of recognition flickering within them. She adjusted her cap, her movements deliberate, and wheeled toward the helicopter. The diner's patrons watched, their faces a mix of confusion and awe. Who was she? And why had the military come for her? The bond between Ella Monroe and the world had frayed, unraveling like an old sweater, ever since her husband's death left a jagged hole in her heart. Grief had coiled around her, pulling her inward, away from the chatter and bustle of the small town she called home. She lived in the quiet margins, her days soft and unassuming, her past as a veteran buried deep beneath layers of silence. No one in town knew of her service, not the librarian who smiled at her in the stacks, nor the grocer who rang up her bread and tea. Tucked inside her worn leather bag, she kept 2 relics of that other life. A faded photograph of her unit, their faces young and fierce under desert skies, and her medical insignia, its edges smoothed by time. She guarded them like secrets, touching them only in private, as if their existence might summon memories too heavy to bear. 3 weeks ago, an email had pierced her carefully constructed solitude. It arrived at the library's public computer, where Ella spent her mornings lost in books. The subject line was stark. "We've been searching for you." The message was brief, formal, Signed by Lieutenant Mark Dawson of the 3rd Airborne Medical Division. "We haven't forgotten," it read. The words stirred something in her, fear perhaps, or the faint ache of a life she'd left behind. She didn't reply. Instead, she printed the email, folded it into her bag, and carried on. But today, she slipped the photograph into her coat pocket, its weight a quiet companion, as if to whisper, "If no one else remembers, I will." Her Saturdays followed a familiar rhythm, each step a quiet act of defiance against her isolation. First, the diner, where she'd order coffee and toast, though the waitress often ignored her eyes sliding past Ella's wheelchair as if it rendered her invisible. Then, the park, where she'd sit on a bench dedicated to veterans, its placard just out of reach from her seat. Finally, the Veterans Memorial 3 blocks away, a place she'd helped shape decades ago. She'd suggested the inscription, "For those who served without recognition," her voice steady in the committee meeting, her own service a secret even then. No one knew the words were partly for her, a quiet nod to the life she'd hidden. Today, as she sat in the diner, the usual slight stung more than usual. The waitress, young and distracted, refused her order with a curt, "We're busy." Ella's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. She'd learned long ago to swallow indignity. In another life, her hands, now knotted with arthritis, had been deft and steady, guiding a penlight through a sandstorm to perform emergency surgery when generators failed. Those hands had carried soldiers twice her size through gunfire when stretchers ran out, their blood soaking her uniform. They'd extracted shrapnel millimeters from an artery, her pulse calm even as bullets whined overhead. The young men at the counter, laughing too loudly, mocking her slow movements, couldn't know any of this. They couldn't know her limp, the price of saving 18 lives when her helicopter crashed, was a badge of sacrifice heavier than any medal. She left the diner, her coffee untouched, and wheeled herself to the park. The bench welcomed her, its wood worn smooth by years of her quiet visits. She unwrapped a piece of bread, her movements deliberate, savoring the small act of independence. The irony of the bench's dedication wasn't lost on her, honoring those who served, yet inaccessible to her in her chair. She let her gaze drift, her thoughts wandering to the desert, to the faces in that photograph, to the life she'd left behind. A low rumble snapped her back to the present. A military vehicle, out of place in this sleepy town, rolled slowly down the street. Ella froze, bread halfway to her mouth, her heart quickening. The vehicle stopped at the intersection, and 2 soldiers in crisp uniforms stepped out, their eyes scanning the park. Her breath caught. For 28 years, she'd guarded her privacy, her silence a shield against the world. Had they found her? Why now? She rewrapped her bread with care, tucking the photograph deeper into her bag, her movements betraying none of the storm inside her. Back at the diner, the ground began to tremble, a faint vibration that grew into a thunderous roar. Heads turned, forks paused mid-bite. A massive Chinook helicopter descended, its blades slicing the air, landing just 50 meters from the diner's door. Dust swirled, glasses rattled, and the room fell silent. 6 soldiers in special operations uniforms emerged, their movements precise, forming a line and saluting in unison. Their leader, Lieutenant Colonel Mark Dawson, stepped forward, his face etched with purpose. He was older now, but his eyes held the same intensity Ella had seen decades ago in Iraq, when he was just 19, bleeding out from an arterial wound she'd stitched under fire. She'd saved him, then vanished from military records, her identity fading like a ghost. "We're here for Captain Ella Monroe," Dawson announced, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. A server's tray slipped, a glass shattering on the floor. The young men in the corner shrank back, their bravado evaporating. A whisper rippled through the room. She was military? Another soldier spoke, his voice carrying a quiet reverence. "Not just military. She's the ghost medic of Desert Storm, a legend in the medical corps." Ella, still on her park bench, remained oblivious to the bench's scene unfolding. She stared at the horizon, her thoughts heavy with the weight of years. A small military vehicle approached, its engine soft against the park's quiet. A young soldier stepped out, his posture respectful, his head bowed slightly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gentle, "the unit would like to see you. They've waited 28 years." Ella's face remained still, but her hand trembled against her wheelchair's armrest, a flicker of emotion breaking through her calm. She nodded once, a gesture so slight it might have gone unnoticed. The soldier offered his hand, but she waved it away with a quiet dignity. "I've managed on my own this long," she said, her voice steady but soft, laced with the resolve that had carried her through war and loss. The soldiers had deployed a ramp, and she descended it slowly, her silver hair catching into the breeze. Her expression was gentle, resigned, as if she'd always known this moment would come. At the memorial site, the crowd parted, their murmurs fading. Dawson approached, knelt, his cap in hand, knelt before her. "Captain Monroe," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "you saved lives. We're here to remember." He presented a small box, its contents gleaming faintly. A bronze star, the honor for courage she'd never received. Ella's eyes met his, and for a moment, the years fell away. She saw the boy she'd saved, the lives she'd touched, the cost she'd paid. Her fingers brushed the metal, not with triumph, but with a quiet acceptance, as if this, at last, was enough. The street outside the diner was frozen in time, as if the world had paused to catch its breath. Onlookers stood rooted to the ground, their faces etched with a mixture of awe and disbelief. A man in the crowd held his phone aloft, capturing the moment, his hands trembling slightly as he recorded. Nearby, an elderly woman dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue, her weathered face crumpling with emotion she couldn't quite name. She had seen many things in her long life, but this was something sacred. The mother from the diner, the one who had been nursing a coffee inside just moments ago, had followed the growing commotion. Now she stood on the sidewalk, hoisting her young son onto her shoulders so he could see over the sea of heads. Her heart raced, stirred by the weight of the moment, though she wasn't yet sure why. She glanced down at her boy, his wide eyes taking in the scene. "You remember that lady from earlier?" she whispered, her voice catching. He nodded, his small face serious. "She's not invisible anymore," she said, more to herself than to him, as a swell of gratitude tightened her chest. Lieutenant Colonel Dawson's voice rang out, steady and commanding, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. He held a citation in his hands, its words heavy with meaning. "Captain Ella Monroe," he began, his tone reverent, "during Operation Desert Storm, with complete disregard for her own safety, treated wounded personnel under direct enemy fire." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling through the gathered crowd. Ella, seated in her wheelchair at the center of the ceremony, stared straight ahead, her expression composed but her hands gripping the armrest tightly. Inside, her heart churned. She hadn't thought of that day in years, not because she wanted to forget, but because it was woven so deeply into her being that it no longer needed to be named. For 18 hours she had knelt in the sand, her hands slick with blood, her mind razor sharp despite the exhaustion threatening to pull her under. She had saved 37 soldiers, each one a life she could still picture, each one a story that had gone on because of her. As Dawson read, a single tear traced a slow path down her cheek, betraying the stoic mask she wore. She didn't cry for herself, she never had, but for the weight of those lives, those moments, now laid bare before strangers. The diner's customers had spilled out onto the street, drawn by the spectacle. They stood in stunned silence, their earlier chatter replaced by a humbling stillness. Among them was the young waitress who had refused Ella's service earlier that day, her face now pale with recognition. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a sickening mix of shame and regret. She remembered Ella's quiet presence at the counter, the way she had barely looked up when the refusal came, the way her weathered hands had folded neatly in her lap. The waitress's stomach twisted as she realized who she had dismissed. A woman who had faced death to save others, a woman whose courage dwarfed anything she could imagine. She wanted to disappear, to rewind the day and undo her mistake, but the truth stood before her, unyielding. Dawson's voice continued, recounting Ella's service in Bosnia. "Captain Monroe was critically injured while attempting to reach downed personnel," he said, his words deliberate. Despite her own injuries, she directed medical care for others until rescue arrived, ensuring no casualties in an operation that, by all military estimates, should have claimed at least a dozen lives. And the crowd absorbed this in silence. each person grappling with the image of a woman, broken and bleeding, refusing to yield until every soul under her care was safe. Ella's mind drifted to that day, the chaos, the pain searing through her body, the desperate focus that kept her moving. She hadn't thought of herself as a hero then, only as someone doing what needed to be done. Now, as her former unit surrounded her wheelchair, their faces a mix of pride and grief, she felt the weight of their gratitude like a physical thing. Each soldier stepped forward, their voices low but steady, introducing themselves with stories that pierced her heart. "My father was in Basra," one said, his eyes shining. "You saved his leg. He still walks because of you." Another, a woman with a medic's bearing, said, "I was the one you trained. Everything I know started with you." A young man, barely old enough to have served, choked on his words. "My mother was on your last flight in Bosnia. She tells me every birthday that I exist because of you." Ella's throat tightened. She hadn't known about the child born in that bunker, hadn't known her actions had rippled so far. The gratitude in their voices was almost too much to bear. The helicopter that had brought the unit sat silent, its blades still, but its presence sent a shiver through the crowd. Phones continued to record, their lenses capturing a moment that felt too big for any screen. Voices hushed, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the reverence of the scene. At the edge of the crowd, the young men from the diner, those who had mocked Ella earlier, tried to slip away, their faces burning with embarrassment. They had laughed at her quiet demeanor, her worn clothes, her solitude, not knowing the weight of the life she carried. Dawson's sharp eyes caught them. "Gentlemen," he called, his voice edged with a steel. "Perhaps you'd like to meet the woman you found so amusing earlier." They froze, their bravado crumbling under the weight of their shame. Ella, sensing the tension, raised a hand, her gesture calm but firm. "That's unnecessary, Lieutenant Colonel," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced the crowd. It was a voice rarely used in public now, but it held the same strength that had guided soldiers through chaos. "Respect isn't taught through humiliation," she continued, her gaze steady. "They didn't know." One of the young men, his face flushed with remorse, stepped forward anyway. "Ma'am," he stammered, his head bowed. I'm sorry." Ella met his eyes, her expression softening. "Accepted," she said simply. The exchange was brief, but it carried a power that no grand apology could match. The young man stepped back, his shoulders lighter, but his heart still heavy with the lesson. A young lieutenant approached Ella, his hands cradling a folded flag. "From the unit you saved," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We've carried your name with us every deployment since." He placed the flag in her lap, and Ella's fingers brushed over it, her touch reverent. The gesture stirred something deep within her, a sense of connection to the soldiers she had served alongside, the ones who had carried her legacy even when she had tried to leave it behind. Dawson turned to the crowd, his voice rising to address them all. "For years, we've searched for Captain Monroe to properly honor her service," he said. "She declined all previous attempts, saying only that she had done her duty." He turned to Ella, his eyes softening. "Captain, your duty went far beyond what was asked of you. Today, we return the honor you've always deserved." The soldiers raised their hands in a unified salute, their movements crisp and precise. Ella, seated in her wheelchair, returned the salute with the same military precision, her muscle memory untouched by years or injury. The crowd watched in respectful silence, their hearts full of a quiet pride. As the ceremony drew to a close, Dawson leaned down, his voice low enough for only Ella to hear. "Why did you hide for so long, Captain?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. Ella looked up at him, her gaze clear and unflinching. "Because the work was what mattered," she said softly, "not the recognition." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of a life lived in service. Dawson nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "And now?" he prompted gently. Ella's lips curved into a faint, weary smile. "Now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm too tired to run anymore." The admission cost her something, but it also set her free. For years, she had carried her service quietly, letting it fade into the background of a world that moved on. Now, surrounded by those who remembered, she allowed herself to be seen. The next day, the local newspaper ran a headline that captured the moment. "The invisible hero, Captain Ella Monroe found and honored. The story spread, touching hearts far beyond the small town. Ella was invited to live at a distinguished veterans residence in North Carolina, a place where she could find comfort, medical care, and the companionship of those who understood the cost of service. At first she hesitated, her independence a hard-won thing. But as she sat with Dawson, the offer lingering between them, she felt the weight of her solitude. "I've been alone long enough," she admitted, her voice soft but resolute. The decision felt like a new chapter, one she hadn't expected to write. The diner, too, was changed by the day's events. Near the entrance, they placed a small plaque, its words simple but heartfelt. "We didn't see her before, but we'll never forget her again." The young waitress, still haunted by her earlier mistake, brought flowers to the park where the ceremony had taken place. She laid them at the base of a tree, her hands trembling, as she whispered a quiet apology to the woman who had taught her to look closer, to see the heroes hidden in plain sight. For Ella, the recognition was not the end, but a quiet continuation, a reminder that the work, in all its forms, had always been enough. The morning after the dramatic helicopter landing, the small town awoke to find the familiar bench outside the diner replaced. In its place stood a sturdy new one, its polished wood engraved with the words, "To those who serve silently." The simple phrase carried a weight that seemed to settle into the hearts of passers-by, a quiet tribute to those whose sacrifices had long gone unnoticed. Lieutenant Colonel Dawson, a man whose stern exterior hid a deep well of respect for those under his command, reached out to Ella's daughter, Emily. His call was brief but heavy with purpose, inviting her to a formal commendation ceremony at Fort Bragg to honor her mother, Captain Ella Monroe. Emily arrived at Fort Bragg with a heart full of questions she'd never dared to ask. She stood among the rows of soldiers, her eyes tracing the lines of their crisp uniforms, each face reflecting a shared understanding of duty. As the ceremony began, the air grew thick with emotion. When the commanding officer spoke of Ella's courage, her years as a battlefield medic, her steady hands saving countless lives under fire, Emily's chest tightened. Tears spilled down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that her mother, the quiet woman in the wheelchair, had been a force of nature. "I never knew who my mother was until today," she whispered to Dawson, her voice trembling with pride and a pang of regret for the years spent misunderstanding the woman who raised her. Ella had insisted on a small ceremony, her humility shaping every detail. She wanted no fanfare, no politicians grandstanding for cameras, no press beyond the local paper that had known her story for years, but respected her desire for privacy. The gathering was intimate, a circle of soldiers, some still serving, others long retired, who stood in quiet reverence for one of their own. Their presence was a testament to Ella, a woman who had carried the weight of war in her heart and her body, yet asked for nothing in return. The soldier's eyes met hers not with pity, but with the kind of respect forged in shared trials, a bond that needed no words. In the wake of the ceremony, a foundation was established in Ella's name, a beacon of hope for injured veterans. It provided specialized wheelchairs, each one a lifeline to independence for those whose bodies bore the scars of service. The diner's owner, a gruff man named Tom who had run the place for decades, made a pilgrimage to Ella's new residence. In his hands was a handwritten letter, its edges worn from his nervous grip. "Your meal is always on the house, Captain," he said, his voice thick with shame for the times his diner had failed to see her. Ella, her eyes sharp but kind, shook her head. "I don't want special treatment now," she said firmly, "just equal treatment for everyone." Her words were not a rebuke, but a gentle nudge towards something better, a reminder that dignity wasn't a privilege to be earned. It was a right. The young men who had once mocked Ella, their careless words cutting deeper than they'd realized, found their consciences stirred. They penned a letter to her, their handwriting uneven with the weight of their regret. Enclosed was a donation to the Veterans Hospital and a pledge to volunteer there each month, a promise to make amends through action. Ella read their words carefully, her fingers tracing the paper as if feeling the sincerity behind it. She pinned the letter to the wall beside her bronze star, a medal she rarely spoke of but carried with quiet pride. When a friend asked why she kept it there, Ella's lips curved into a thoughtful smile. "Redemption matters more than retribution," she said, her voice steady with the wisdom of someone who had seen both the worst and best of humanity. At the veterans' residence, Ella began to share her stories, not the tales of heroism that others might expect, but the small human moments that had sustained her through the chaos of war. She spoke of the soldier who sang off-key to calm his wounded friend, of the nurse who shared her last piece of chocolate with a frightened patient, of the quiet laughter that could pierce even the darkest nights in a war zone. Her words painted a picture of camaraderie and resilience, of people finding light in the shadows. These stories became her gift to the young military physicians she mentored. Her medical expertise, now a bridge to their future. The medicine is the easy part, she told them, her voice soft but firm, remembering the person beneath the wounds. That's what saves lives. Her mentees listened, their eyes wide, knowing they were learning from someone who had lived every word she spoke. 6 months after the Chinook helicopter had landed in the street, its blades slicing through the town's complacency, a documentary filmmaker approached Ella. He was young, earnest, his camera a tool for uncovering hidden truths. "Why now, he asked, curious why a woman who had shunned recognition for so long was finally willing to share her story. Ella leaned back in her wheelchair, her gaze drifting to the window where sunlight spilled across the room. She thought of the soldiers she'd carried off battlefield, their faces etched in her memory. She thought of the veterans who moved through the world unseen, their scars hidden or misunderstood. "Because now it isn't about me," she said at last. "It's about all the invisible people, the ones in wheelchairs, with canes, with scars you can't see. If my story makes someone look twice before judging, then it's worth telling." The filmmaker nodded, struck by the quiet power of her words. He hesitated, then asked, "In the helicopter entrance, was that your idea?" For the first time in the interview, Ella laughed, a bright, genuine sound that filled the room. "Military subtlety has never been our strong suit," she said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. What surprised Ella most about her new life wasn't the recognition or the comfort of her new apartment. Though both were welcome, it was the freedom, the simple, profound relief of no longer hiding who she was. For years she had been Captain Ella Monroe, but the world saw only the woman in the wheelchair. Now she was both, and neither defined her alone. In her apartment, she hung a photograph that had stayed hidden in her bag for years, a faded image of her younger self, standing tall in her uniform, surrounded by the soldiers she'd saved. Below it, she placed a crumpled napkin from her final visit to the diner, a small token of a day that had changed everything. It was a reminder that journeys don't always end where we plan, but where they're meant to. Some people serve their entire lives, yet remain unseen, their sacrifices woven into the fabric of others' freedom. A woman in a wheelchair might once have carried hundreds off battlefields, her strength defying the limits of her body. Being forgotten stings, but being misjudged cuts deeper. That day when the Chinook landed, its roar shaking the street, every gaze shifted, not because of the noise, but because the town suddenly saw Ella for who she had always been. They had simply never looked closely enough. The greatest heroes aren't always the ones with medals pinned to their chests, but those who quietly touch lives, their impact rippling outward in ways no one expects. The diner still stands on that same corner, its neon sign buzzing softly in the evening light. The park bench beneath the willow tree remains, its inscription a quiet call to remember. Now, when someone in a wheelchair enters the diner, every door is held open, every path cleared, every glance filled with respect. Sometimes change arrives with the thunder of helicopter blades, shaking the world awake. And sometimes it's the quiet presence of a woman like Ella that reminds us to see what was always there, right before our eyes.